Most people understand that websites and apps remember things, but they usually do not understand how many different kinds of tracking happen at once or how those signals can be combined to build a detailed picture of behavior. A single visit to an online store can involve not just the site itself, but analytics services, advertising systems, performance monitoring, fraud tools, and embedded media, each collecting bits of information. Inside an app, tracking can feel even more invisible because there is no address bar, fewer obvious indicators, and more background activity tied to device identifiers. The privacy challenge is not that measurement is always bad, because organizations do need to understand whether features work and whether systems are secure. The problem is when tracking becomes broad, hard to see, and hard to control, or when people are told it is minimal while the system actually collects extensive data. Monitoring web and in-app tracking transparently means two things at once. You keep watch over what your systems are collecting and sharing, and you communicate that reality to users in a way that is clear and fair. The goal is to prevent surprise by making tracking accountable, measurable, and aligned with what users reasonably expect. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CIPT.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful place to begin is defining what tracking means in this context, because the word is often used loosely. Tracking is any collection of signals that can be used to observe behavior over time, especially when those signals can be linked to a person or device across sessions, pages, or apps. Tracking can involve cookies, but it also includes device identifiers, unique tokens, browser storage, fingerprinting-like signals, and account-based identifiers that follow someone wherever they sign in. In apps, tracking can include advertising identifiers, SDK telemetry, in-app event logs, crash reports, and marketing attribution signals that connect an ad click to later purchases. Even when individual events do not contain a name, they can become personal when combined with stable identifiers or when linked to an account. Beginners often assume that tracking is only for advertising, but tracking also supports analytics, debugging, security monitoring, and product improvement. The privacy risk depends on purpose, identifiability, and sharing, not just on whether the tracking is called analytics or ads. Transparent monitoring starts with naming the kinds of tracking you have and acknowledging that they serve different goals and carry different impacts. To monitor tracking, you need visibility into what is actually being collected and transmitted, because documentation often lags behind reality. Websites and apps change frequently, and a small code update can add new events, new data fields, or a new third-party endpoint without anyone intending to expand tracking. Visibility means knowing what events exist, what data each event includes, what identifiers are attached, and which destinations receive the event. It also means knowing whether tracking occurs only when a user interacts or also in the background, such as when an app launches, resumes, or runs quietly. Another visibility question is whether tracking varies by region, user type, or settings, because systems often behave differently depending on consent choices or platform rules. Beginners sometimes assume that if a privacy policy lists tracking generally, then the organization knows what it does, but many organizations do not have an accurate live inventory. Transparent monitoring treats tracking like an asset that must be inventoried and verified, not like a vague feature you assume is under control. A critical part of transparency is understanding the difference between first-party tracking and third-party tracking, because the risks and expectations can be different. First-party tracking is when the organization operating the site or app collects data for its own purposes, such as measuring feature usage or preventing fraud. Third-party tracking is when data is sent to another company that may use it for its own purposes, such as advertising networks, analytics providers, or embedded content providers. Even if third-party data use is restricted by contract, the data still leaves the organization's direct control, which increases exposure and complexity. Another subtle point is that a third party can be present even when users do not see it, because it can be embedded as code libraries or software components. Beginners often think third parties are only obvious, like social media widgets. but many third parties are purely behind the scenes. Monitoring must therefore include a clear understanding of which third parties exist, what they receive, and why they are needed. Transparency requires communicating not just that tracking exists, but who is involved and what boundaries limit their use. Data minimization is a practical way to make tracking safer and more defensible, and it also supports transparency because simpler tracking is easier to explain honestly. Minimization begins with collecting only the events you truly need and avoiding event payloads that include sensitive or unnecessary data. A classic tracking mistake is capturing full URLs that contain sensitive parameters or capturing free text fields that might include personal details users typed, such as search queries, names, or support messages. Another mistake is collecting persistent identifiers when short-lived session identifiers would work for basic measurement. Minimization also applies to granularity, because logging every scroll, tap, or keystroke can create rich behavioral profiles even if the data seems harmless. Transparent monitoring includes reviewing event definitions and removing fields that do not serve a clear purpose. When teams feel tempted to log more because storage is cheap, privacy discipline reminds them that exposure is not cheap, and each new data point is a liability to protect. Consent and choice are central to transparency, but they can become misleading if they are treated as a legal shield rather than a genuine user control. If a user declines tracking and the system still sends detailed identifiers to third parties, then transparency is broken even if the user clicked a button. On the web, consent choices often relate to cookies and similar storage, but tracking can still happen through other mechanisms. So monitoring must confirm that opt-out choices actually reduce data collection and sharing. In apps, users may have platform-level settings related to advertising tracking, but apps can still collect analytics and device identifiers, and users may not realize what is happening. Transparent monitoring, therefore, includes verifying behavior under different user settings and ensuring the system honors the intended choices. Beginners sometimes assume that consent banners solve privacy, but banners can become performative if the underlying tracking remains extensive. Real transparency means the system's behavior matches what the interface implies. Another important area is the life cycle of tracking data, because the privacy impact often comes from accumulation over time. Tracking events are usually stored in analytics systems, data warehouses, logging platforms, or vendor dashboards, and those stores can persist for years if not managed. Retention should be defined so that raw event data does not live forever, especially if it includes identifiers or sensitive context. Derived metrics, like aggregated counts, can often be retained longer with less risk, but that depends on how aggregation is done and whether small groups can still be singled out. Deletion is also part of lifecycle, because users may have rights or expectations around removing data, and organizations may need to purge old tracking data to reduce exposure. Monitoring must include knowing where tracking data is stored and whether retention and deletion controls are actually enforced. Beginners often focus on collection but forget that storage systems multiply risk because tracking data can be copied, exported, and joined with other datasets. Transparent monitoring treats lifecycle as part of the tracking design, not an afterthought. In-app tracking introduces additional complexity because apps often rely on software development kits, which can collect data beyond what the app developer explicitly intended. An SDK might capture device details, network information, or usage events as part of its default behavior, and that behavior can change when the SDK updates. This creates a change management challenge, because a routine library update can expand tracking without a deliberate product decision. Monitoring, therefore, includes maintaining an up-to-date inventory of SDKs, understanding what data each one collects, and reviewing changes when versions are updated. Another risk is that multiple SDKs can each collect similar identifiers, which increases the number of parties that can link behavior across contexts. Transparent monitoring in apps also means making sure that permissions and settings are respected and that data collection does not exceed what is necessary for the app's functionality. Beginners sometimes assume that app tracking is simpler than web tracking, but in practice, the embedded component ecosystem can make it harder to see and control. A careful approach treats SDK management as a core privacy control. A common misconception about tracking is that pseudonymous identifiers solve privacy, because they are not names. In reality, pseudonymous IDs can be extremely powerful because they allow long-term linking of events, building profiles that can later be tied to a person through account login, purchase, or even indirect inference. Another misconception is that anonymization is easy, when many tracking datasets can be re-identified if they contain enough unique behavior patterns or if they can be joined with other data sources. A third misconception is that transparency means telling users everything in one long document, when most people need simple, timely explanations tied to their choices. Transparent monitoring involves being honest about what tracking can do and resisting language that downplays capability. If you say you collect only basic analytics, you should be able to demonstrate what basic means in terms of fields, identifiers, retention, and sharing. Transparency is not only a communication challenge, it is a discipline that depends on accurate system knowledge. Monitoring also includes auditing third-party endpoints and data flows because tracking often involves network calls that are not obvious from the user experience. A privacy-aware organization regularly checks what domains the site or app communicates with, what data is sent, and whether those flows match what was approved. This matters because some tracking systems can accidentally include sensitive data, like user IDs and URLs, or can transmit data before consent choices are processed. It also matters because third parties can change their own systems, introduce new subprocessors, or modify data handling practices, which can change risk even if your code does not change. Transparent monitoring includes governance around adding new tracking partners, requiring justification, and documenting the approved purpose and fields shared. Beginners sometimes think vendor vetting is separate from tracking, but tracking is one of the most common reasons data is shared with outside parties. When you monitor endpoints and partners, you prevent shadow tracking from appearing quietly in your ecosystem. Communication is the part that makes monitoring transparent, because monitoring without user-facing clarity still leaves people in the dark. Transparent communication means explaining what tracking is for, what data is involved, and what choices people have, in language that matches the moment. If you track for security, explain that you log certain events to prevent fraud or abuse, and describe the boundaries, such as limited retention and restricted access. If you track for product improvement, explain what you measure and why, and avoid implying it is anonymous if it can still be linked over time. If you share data with third parties, explain the nature of that sharing and what safeguards exist, rather than hiding behind broad phrases. Another transparency practice is providing user-accessible controls, such as settings to limit tracking and clear indicators of what choices mean. Beginners often assume users do not care, but people care deeply when tracking feels hidden or when it seems to exceed necessity. Trust grows when the organization communicates plainly and behaves consistently with those statements. It is also important to recognize that transparency is not only about users, but also about internal transparency so teams do not accidentally violate commitments. Product teams, marketing teams, and engineering teams often want different measurements, and without shared guardrails, tracking expands by default. Monitoring should therefore include internal policies that define acceptable tracking, approval processes for new events and partners, and standards for data field review. It should also include training so teams understand why capturing full URLs or free text inputs is risky, and why stable identifiers should be used carefully. Internal transparency also means keeping an accurate tracking taxonomy. So when someone says conversion event or session ID, everyone knows what it includes and how it is used. Beginners might think privacy is mostly a user-facing issue, but many privacy failures come from internal confusion and inconsistent definitions. When monitoring and definitions are consistent internally, external transparency becomes easier and more credible. A practical way to tie all of this together is to treat tracking like a controlled system with measurable boundaries. You define what events exist, what fields they carry, what identifiers are attached, where the data goes, and how long it stays. You verify that consent choices and settings actually change behavior, rather than assuming they do. You manage SDKs and third-party partners as change risks that require review and monitoring, not as set-and-forget components. You minimize data, especially anything that could be sensitive or unexpectedly revealing, and you limit retention so tracking does not become a long-term behavioral archive by default. Then you communicate clearly, matching your explanations to what the system really does, and providing meaningful controls that users can use without confusion. Monitoring web and in-app tracking transparently is not about eliminating measurement. It is about ensuring measurement is honest, proportionate, and bounded. When you can prove your tracking practices and explain them in plain language, you reduce surprise, reduce risk, and build trust that can survive the reality that digital systems do, in fact, observe behavior.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.